A trail of tears and death. Those 5 words are among the most recognized in all of American history. You have heard them. You have read them on monuments, in textbooks, in museum plaques from Georgia to Oklahoma. But almost no one can tell you who actually said them first. Not a president, not a general, not a historian writing decades later. The man who spoke those words was a Choctaw chief, standing in the freezing mud outside Little Rock, Arkansas, watching his people die around him. He gave the tragedy its name. And then, history took that name, handed it to another nation entirely, and quietly erased his. You were taught this phrase belongs to the Cherokee. That is what almost everyone believes. Say the words Trail of Tears, and the image that comes to mind is the Cherokee removal of 1838, the long walk from the mountains of Georgia and North Carolina to Indian Territory. And that removal was real, and it was monstrous, and thousands of Cherokee people died on it. But it was not first. It was not even close to first. 7 years before the Cherokee were forced from their homes, another nation had already been driven west along nearly the same route, through the same cold, under the same broken promises. They were the Choctaw. The Choctaw had lived in what is now Mississippi and western Alabama for longer than anyone can measure. They were farmers, not wanderers. They had signed treaty after treaty with the young United States, 9 of them between 1786 and 1830, and they had fought alongside American soldiers, including under Andrew Jackson himself. They were, in the language of the time, one of the so-called civilized tribes. None of it saved them. And it was a Choctaw voice, not a Cherokee one, that first described the road west as a trail of tears and death. To understand how the words of one people became the memory of another, we have to go back to a treaty signed by lamplight in a Mississippi field, and to the winter that followed. The promise was written into the treaty itself. In September of 1830, at a place called Dancing Rabbit Creek in central Mississippi, representatives of the United States sat down across from the leaders of the Choctaw Nation. This was the first removal treaty signed after Andrew Jackson pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress that same year. It would become the model for every removal that came after, and the Choctaw did not want to sign it. One account from the period put it plainly: not a single Choctaw favored the sale and cession of the lands of the tribe. It had not a solitary advocate among them, but they were cornered. The state of Mississippi had just extended its laws over Choctaw territory, and President Jackson told them, in effect, that the federal government would not protect them from those laws. Stay and lose everything under a hostile state. Leave and lose their homeland. Under that pressure, the chiefs signed. In exchange for roughly 11 million acres of their ancestral land east of the Mississippi River, they were promised land in what is now Oklahoma and a set of guarantees. And here is where the promises begin to crack. Article 14 of the treaty said that any Choctaw who wished to stay in Mississippi could do so, become a citizen of the United States, and keep 640 acres of land for the head of each family, with more for each child. On paper, it made the Choctaw the first native people offered American citizenship. It sounded like mercy. In practice, it was a trap. The federal agent responsible for registering those families made it nearly impossible to sign up. Deadlines were buried. Paperwork vanished. Names went unrecorded. Speculators and settlers moved onto the land before the ink was dry, and the courts sided with the newcomers. Of the thousands who tried to stay under Article 14 and hold on to the graves of their ancestors, the overwhelming majority were cheated out of the land they had been promised in writing. There was another promise, too. Another article of the treaty guaranteed that no state and no territory would ever have the right to pass laws over the Choctaw Nation, that the new land in the West would belong to them and their descendants forever, secured from American law for all time. Forever, it turned out, had an expiration date measured in decades. But in the winter of 1831, none of that betrayal had fully arrived yet. What was clear, right then, was that around 15,000 people had been ordered to leave the only home they had ever known and walk hundreds of miles west, and the government that had ordered it was not remotely ready to carry it out. A French aristocrat happened to be standing on the riverbank. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville. He was 26 years old, and he had come to America officially to study its prison system, but really to understand something larger. He wanted to see democracy up close, this bold new experiment that he believed represented the future of the entire world. What he would write about that journey became one of the most famous books ever written about this country, Democracy in America, a book quoted by nearly every American president since. And by pure accident, in December of 1831, he was at Memphis, Tennessee, on the banks of the Mississippi, waiting for a boat to carry him south, when a great crowd of people came out of the forest behind him. They were Choctaw. This was the first wave of the removal, and Tocqueville watched it happen with his own eyes. He wrote it down, and his account survives to this day as a primary source no one can dismiss, because it comes from an outsider with no stake in the story, describing exactly what he saw. He described the depth of winter, the cold unusually severe, the snow frozen hard on the ground, and the river choked with drifting blocks of ice. He described the people. They had brought their whole world with them, he wrote, the wounded, the sick, newborn children, and old men at the very point of death. They had no tents, they had no wagons, they carried only what was in their arms. And then the winter turned the river to ice. Tocqueville watched them prepare to cross that frozen, deadly water, and what struck him most was the silence. There was no crying, he wrote, no sobbing, no complaint. The whole crowd was silent. He called it a spectacle of ruin and destruction, something that had the feel of a final farewell, with no possibility of return. And then came the detail that has haunted readers for almost 2 centuries. As the Choctaw stepped into the boats to cross the river, their dogs stayed behind on the bank. And when the animals finally understood that they were being left, they lifted their heads and howled together, and plunged into the icy water to swim after their masters. Tocqueville, a European nobleman who had come to admire this new democracy, stood there and understood that he was watching that same democracy destroy an entire people. He never forgot it, neither should we, because what he saw at Memphis was only the beginning. The road ahead was worse. 1 in every 3 never arrived. The winter of 1831 turned into one of the harshest on record. A blizzard buried the trail. The Arkansas River froze so solid that the steamboats meant to carry the Choctaw were locked in ice, stranding hundreds of people with no shelter and almost no food. Families had been forced to leave in such a hurry that many had no winter clothing at all. Rations ran out. The government agents, understaffed and overwhelmed, watched supplies rot and prices triple as local traders exploited the desperation. People froze to death waiting. People starved to death waiting. And in the summers that followed, in 1832 and 1833, cholera swept through the camps and killed thousands more. There is one story from that first winter that captures all of it. When the wagons could not cross the frozen Arkansas River and the food gave out, government agents had to send 40 wagons scrambling to reach the stranded families with blankets and supplies. And by the time help arrived, some of the people and some of the soldiers with them had already frozen to death or died of pneumonia where they sat. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply been ordered to leave home in the middle of the coldest winter in memory, with nothing, and told to walk. The numbers are staggering, and historians still argue over exactly how high they climb. Of the roughly 15,000 to 17,000 Choctaw who were removed across 3 waves, the estimates of the dead range from 2,500 to as many as 6,000, 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire nation gone. But a death toll is not just a number, it is a specific loss. And for the Choctaw, the losses that cut deepest were the elders. In a nation whose history, whose law, whose medicine, and whose sacred knowledge lived not in books, but in the living memory of its oldest people. Every elder who died on that trail took an entire library into the ground with them. Songs that had been sung for 1,000 years went silent. Stories that had survived every hardship before this one ended in a frozen ditch in Arkansas, with no one left who remembered how they began. The Choctaw had governed themselves through a sophisticated system of elected chiefs and open public debate, a genuine democracy that predated the one Tocqueville had crossed an ocean to study. And the people who carried that system in their minds were dying faster than anyone else. It was in this moment, as the wagons reached Little Rock and the dead were being counted, that a Choctaw chief, remembered by history as most likely a leader named Nitakechi, spoke to a reporter from the Arkansas Gazette. He described what his people had endured. He called it a trail of tears and death. The reporter printed it, and the phrase was born. 7 years later, a different tribe walked the same road. In 1838, the Cherokee Nation was forced from its homeland in the southern Appalachians and marched west to the same Indian territory. Their suffering was immense, and roughly 4,000 Cherokee died. The American press, which had by then fully absorbed that vivid phrase from the Arkansas Gazette, reached for it again, and this time it stuck. The Cherokee removal was larger in the national imagination, better documented by sympathetic outsiders, closer to the coming crisis over states' rights and federal power. So when the phrase "Trail of Tears" entered permanent American memory, it entered attached to the Cherokee. The Cherokee had their own name for what happened to them. In their language, they called it the trail where they cried. It is a true name and a sacred one. But the English phrase, the one carved into monuments and printed in every textbook, the one the whole world now knows, did not come from them. It came from a Choctaw chief standing in the Arkansas cold, describing his own people's dead 7 years earlier. The words were borrowed, the credit was not returned. And so a nation that had gone first, suffered first, and named the tragedy first, slowly slipped out of the story that its own words had created. The words were Choctaw. The memory became someone else's. This is how erasure actually works. Not always through a lie, but through a slow substitution, a story that gets simpler and more famous each time it is told, until the people at its origin are quietly written out. The Choctaw were the first nation removed under the Indian Removal Act. Their treaty was the template for all the others. Their chief gave the entire era its most enduring name. And yet if you asked 100 people today who coined the phrase "Trail of Tears," almost none of them would say the Choctaw. Before we reach the end, if you believe forgotten history deserves to be pulled back into the light, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories the textbooks left out. They are still here. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, and the Jena Band of Choctaw Indians endure to this day, hundreds of thousands of people strong. Every year, their descendants walk and ride the old routes to remember what was taken and what survived. They have never needed a textbook or a monument to remind them whose words those were, because they carry that memory in their own families, generation after generation. But the rest of us might need reminding, because a phrase this heavy, carrying this much grief, deserves to be traced back to the mouth that first spoke it. The next time you hear the words "Trail of Tears," remember the frozen bank at Memphis, remember the elders who never reached Oklahoma, and remember the Choctaw chief who looked at his dying people and found the only language terrible enough to describe it. If this story moved something in you, and you believe the people who named a tragedy deserve to be remembered for it, hit subscribe. This channel exists to give forgotten history its name back, one story at a time. Share this with one person who thinks they already know the whole story. And tell me in the comments, before today, did you know the phrase came from the Choctaw? I will see you in the next one.